Thank you everyone for joining. Today we're going to go over how, what, and why to incorporate the case method in your courses. We're going to discuss case method and the case-based scenarios for online environments. I know this is a big thing in face-to-face, and so thinking about how we can transition this technique into the online environment is really what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to define what the case method is, and hopefully you can help me do that. Identify ways to incorporate case studies in your online course. We're going to go over kind of the how, what steps we should take, what are things to consider when making cases for the online environment, and innovative techniques to incorporate them into your class. So that will be the overview for today. So to get started, I wanted to identify what words come to mind when you hear the case method. I know when you search for articles using case studies, you might not get the teaching aspect of that. You might get some articles and research that use case studies as a method to do research. But in this presentation today, we're really going to focus on the case method of teaching and applying case studies to the teaching environment. So I kind of wanted to get your perspective on what comes to mind when you hear the word case study. And we have several really good examples in this word association right now. And then also quick trivia. Today's topic was really inspired by the Harvard Faculty Lounge, and they put together a newsletter that comes out, I think, once a month on techniques, and they were talking about the centennial use of case studies. So I will show the results on my screen so far of what we got going on in this word cloud, which I think is very relevant. Original cases for review, the nitty-gritty, interactive, discussion, group, real-world examples. That seems to be the biggest one. A lot of people said that. What really happens, real-world application, right? And I think when you think of the word case method, having real-world experiences is really what we're preparing our students to go into the workforce and, use the knowledge and information and applications and discussions that you have in your class in the real world based on the subject area that is focused on in the course. So I think all of these are really, really excellent. So what is the case method? And I think you guys already had a lot of that real world examples, those real world experiences for the students, right? This method has been used for over a century, right, with Harvard. And it's focused on problem-based learning. There's a problem they need to solve and they need to apply what they have learned. It's an authentic assessment technique, right? They're not really memorizing anything. They're using the information in there. Realistic, if possible. I know sometimes some case scenarios have to have a little twist on them, maybe to get at the concept that you're teaching or for them to kind of analyze the situation maybe with a unique lens, but as realistic as possible. Inductive, right? Students get to lead the conversations. They're put in the hot seat, I guess, per se, and really asked to critically think, what's in the case, what information do I have, and we'll go over kind of what the student's role in these case and applying the case method is. Guide on the side. So it's a transition in a teaching approach, right? From sage on the stage to guide on the side. And that's really a preference when you're coming into a teaching methodology of how you feel comfortable getting the message across, allowing students to engage with that information. But this approach is really focused on that guide on the side. Coming from, Frary, who talked about the banking model, right? The case study method, the case method actually is kind of the opposite of that banking model approach, really giving the student that authentic experience of having that control. Collaboration, students are asked to collaborate with one another. They have to maybe challenge colleagues' perspectives, opinions on what they interpreted the information in the case to be, and how they're applying the different information and resources and material in the course and maybe articles outside to kind of get that experience. Dialogue, right? It's about communicating with one another. There has to be some sort of synchronous, asynchronous communication between whether it's a group member or the class, depending on the size of your class, having that open dialogue. And probably my favorite is typically, not all the time, but there's no right or wrong. So it kind of gives students, that feeling of, okay, this is a decision that I have to make. They have to take ownership of what their group comes up with. And they're not maybe emailing the faculty member of, did I get it right? Or is this wrong? They themselves make that decision based on the arguments, the research, the support that they've provided for their position. And we'll talk about how that can work in an online environment. So why incorporate cases? There's a bunch of, oh, sure, yeah, discuss no right or wrong answers. So I'll just go back quickly and typically talk about that just a little bit is sometimes in a like there could be a right or wrong answer if it's like, they follow, this accounting regulation or they didn't, right? And then making that argument. But I think more of letting them come to that decision for themselves of, okay, I think that they did meet the accounting, standard or law, or they didn't because of this, that, or the other. Having them make an argument for their decision, and then kind of basing it up like, oh, maybe I didn't think about that perspective. We're really giving them that control of the right or wrong. But thank you for that comment, Dr. Grunfeld. It might be different in different subject areas, so definitely something to consider. So why incorporate cases? Really, the students become owners of their learning experience. They get to control what the dialogue is, how they're going to interpret it. It really puts them, so you're not necessarily maybe forcing them to do one thing or another. It's really, they take the ownership of themselves, like, okay, I need to solve this case. Okay, I need to do this. Here's what I need to do in order to meet the expectations my professor has set out for me. And it gives them that power, which I think is really important for adult learners. It's a great opportunity for great work and collaboration. We know that in the age that we're in, collaborating online is going to happen when they exit the workforce. They're going to have to interact digitally with their colleagues, their supervisors, and coming to solving issues in their workforce because of it. So having that experience in an online course, allowing them to practice that soft skill, they say, is important, and this provides that opportunity for them to learn. It's applicable to every industry. And I know I say every, and that's a strong word to put there. I should say most, but I honestly think there's a case for every industry. There's a reason for why we're teaching the students the concepts we're teaching them. They're either going to have to apply it, interpret it, use it. They're going to have some sort of information that will be helpful to them. Even if they don't necessarily major, have a career in that area, they're going to use those critical thinking skills. In whatever industry they're in. So I think that's really important. The authentic assessment, right? So you have that alternative to proctoring. Really, there's no proctoring in a case method typically. It's really about an open dialogue, having that facilitation. It kind of takes it shifts the conversation from you have to remember this for a multiple choice exam and then forget it, right? It puts it into, you're going to apply that information in this case, and you're going to need to know so that you can answer the case study questions as a group and contribute. So it could help in that aspect. Critical thinking and debate. So debate is something that I think is super important, especially in an online course, and how to do that we'll talk about later in the session. And it just opens that door for critical thinking, right? Instead of giving them like, here's the right answer, it's talking about why is this the right answer? What information led you to that answer? And puts a little bit deeper into that conversation. And then there's options for flexibility. Is there going to be a trial? And then, the course is structured so at the end, there's a trial, or it could be mini debates throughout the semester, or just discussions, having a discussion amongst a small group to then come to a larger group. And it also allows the student to reflect. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well as we move forward of, do I know this? What information do I need? What other information do I need from my professor, from the research, or something like that to answer this question? So it really puts them in that driver's seat that we talked about. So the student's role. So typically, students are owners of this process. So they have to, these are prompts that you might use when you're talking to your students about applying the case study to their scenario or whatever they have for that assignment. Having these prompts kind of gets the student thinking about maybe what the expectations of them are for this. Um, and kind of helps them understand kind of how the process will flow. And we'll talk a little bit about how rubrics can help with that, while also remaining kind of the guide on the side and letting them think for themselves. Um, what information do I need as a student who I have this case? What is being asked? Am I asked to solve something? Am I being asked to provide an opinion, provide a recommendation? Maybe in the healthcare fields, the scenario is to recommend a certain approach or, recommend a financial situation or something like that. Could also be what they need to do. What information is there? What information do I have? So there's worksheets and things that you can have, groups work on to figure out, okay, what information do I have? What information do I need? And what questions do I still have? That's a nice approach to giving the students some guidance, maybe for some of the undergraduate courses on how to apply some of this. They may not have that tool, maybe in the upper division or graduate courses, but something to get them started thinking about how to use cases, because they can be probably a little intimidating for an incoming freshman or an undergraduate student. So giving them the resources that they need to be successful to kind of go through this process is great.
Nicole, I have a
Yes.
question for you.
Sure.
Would there be a scenario in which the information would be revealed like in pieces as they go forward?
I love that idea, Dr. Judy. I think if the course is structured such that, the students start out with, the first page of a case, right? And then throughout the lessons and the information, as they are learning more about the concepts or the theories or the content of your course, giving them a little bit more information about the case, which may change their perspective, I think is a fabulous idea. That's a great way to kind of incorporate the case method from start to finish. I think that's a really great idea. So how can I assemble this information along with information I have? So one of the other great things about case methods is using that prior knowledge and saying, okay, I learned that in this other, science course about cells. How can I then apply it to maybe a topic like cancer, right? So having those two different informations allows them to use their previous knowledge to then apply it maybe in a later class or a later assignment, something like that. So I think that's also important for students to kind of think back, making those cognitive pathways of what the information was, maybe the factual information that they learned, and then how it's being applied. And then listening, right? I think that's something that is so valuable in this case method, is listening to your colleagues, listening to other people's perspectives, opinions about their interpretation of what this case is, because I think everyone has their own unique lens that they come to a situation with, and it's so important when you have the opportunity to even discuss that with others. And so having them really, students practice listening, active listening, right? And being able to think about how is it going to support or refute kind of what I'm thinking, and then how can I contribute to that, right? How can I contribute to that? So they have this perspective. Maybe I share that perspective. What else can I add? Or what else can I give to maybe enhance that dialogue and that debate? Maybe not to convince the other person, just to provide as a tool for that dialogue. And then something to think about, not just the case scenario, which I think is so important, is maybe thinking outside of the box, is what other resources are out there for the situation, right? Economic, financial, like having students think about maybe where that case is situated, when that case is situated, could also be something you want to direct your students to when they're applying something like this. And then this question is really for the student, not necessarily for the instructor, but what would the student think the desired outcome would be if they were maybe the person making that decision, or maybe the person on the other side who is getting that information or that recommendation? What would be the desired outcome for that client or that person? And then what other questions do they have about the case? Sometimes, and I think if you, there's a ton of literature on this, and I'll put some resources of citations at the end of this and share those. But a lot of the times cases don't have all the information. You're not going to have all the information when you're trying to make a decision about something, right? So understanding that there's still missing components to a case and thinking about that is also, I think, something that would really help in the learning experience for students. This is how I would incorporate it, right? And some of the research that shows maybe some techniques to getting started. So we have the what, we understand what the case method is, what case scenarios are, and then why we should incorporate them and what the student role will be. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how incorporating it in an online class. And it all starts with the objective. What is the goal or the learning outcome you want your students to learn from that case, right? There's got to be a purpose, a reason. We just, especially if you're going to incorporate it across the course, I think that's amazing. Having it build for the students, so at the end, they get to make their final decision. But even if it's just a single assignment, understanding what do I want the student to actually get out of this, right? We know they're going to get the critical thinking, the communication, the dialogue, those soft skills, but what is the content that I really want them to understand and apply? Then we have to gather the case, and we'll talk about some ways to gather that case, because building a case is time consuming. I know that, but we'll talk about some ways to do that. Determine the type of desired student interaction, and I thought this is probably the most important for the online setting, because in a face-to-face class, I recognize that people come to the physical classroom and they can separate into mini groups, or you can have them sit on opposite sides of the classroom and have a dialogue. But it's a little different in the online class. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to get that interaction and maybe what you are scheduled to teach. If you're scheduled to teach a hybrid class or maybe online live lecture and you have that ability to have those synchronous sessions, we'll talk about that. And then also asynchronously, if we don't have that live interaction, what that could look like. And then identify how you want to review the case with the class. Do you want to give them the right answer if there is one? Do you want them to have that, continued thought process of what was that decision? How would I actually do that in the real world? And how do you want the students to come out of that case? So we'll go through each of these right now. So identifying the goal. So this comes back to the module level objectives and ultimately the course level objectives, right? In that week, if it's a week by week assignment or if it's for the course, what is the ultimate goal you want the students to get out of that? What is the purpose of the activity, right? Why are we doing this for the students, right? There's got to be a purpose. And I think communicating that purpose to the students will help them engage with the activity, maybe a little bit more than it just being a homework assignment that they have to turn in. What will the student be able to do at the end of the activity? I think discuss, right, would be a good one. Debate, right? Having those objectives, those measurable verbs communicated to the student of what they're going to be able to do at the end of this and having them kind of anticipate that skill and have them kind of judge themselves on how they met that. And then, thinking to yourself, what information did I provide them in that module or that course that I could build a case around or, look for a case about, considering what is the content in the course. And then what are the key elements inside that case that I need to put in or I need to make sure that they're there in order for the students to succeed and achieve that desired outcome that I'm looking for? So asking yourself these questions when you're thinking about incorporating the case method into your online course are starting with the purpose and the goal of why we're having students do this. So gathering the case, you don't have to do it all yourself. I know when I'm starting to think about writing a case, I have all these incredible ideas of these scenarios that I think would just be incredible and actually show the student the concepts that I'm trying to give them the facts about, right? So I can develop it from my experience. Thinking about when I was in the industry, what are some of the things that came up that I was like, ooh, I have this client, they have this need, how did I approach it, what were my resources, and developing a case from there. Um, Something that I really think is cool is to have the students develop their own case. Will the case be perfect? Probably not, but it's a starting point for the student to think about how this could be a real world scenario. I have a faculty member, she's wonderful, and she has students do this in her advanced math courses. I think a lot of students are like, when am I going to use Euclidean geometry in, in real life? And so having the students research how Euclidean geometry is applied in certain industries, having them start looking for a case, kind of brings back the purpose for the student of being in the class. Why am I here? Maybe it's an elective for them. Maybe it's not one of their core courses, but having some real world example kind of brings them back to that and puts them, again, maybe in the learner, maybe they develop the first part and you work off of that, or they kind of see it themselves and they build this case. Use an existing case. I will put a link to some resources for locating open education resource cases and other things like that, where you can find written cases by professors at other institutions and using them for your course. And you can also modify an existing case that has maybe more of how you're teaching the class into it, maybe your lens on that specific concept, and kind of reworking it to fit the needs of your objective. And there's probably a lot more other ways to develop cases, but these are the ones that I thought would be helpful. So let's talk about the interaction in an online. How is this going to work, right? In an online environment, how do you get that dialogue and that critical thinking and that process? So I think it starts with determining kind of how your course is set up. Do you have those synchronous live sessions with the students? And if so, let's just go with the synchronous at the moment, where students meet in person once a week, once a month, to go over their materials in the class. In this case, I would probably go through like a flipped classroom approach to implement the case method, where students are provided with the case, the information, the content and materials in Canvas or your learning management system, and having that be laid out for them in the modules. And then when they get to the synchronous session, that's where that rich debate and dialogue and conversation can be, is in those synchronous sessions. Obviously, there has to be structure to those synchronous sessions of, who's going to speak when, if there's small groups, maybe having an order to the small groups, having, a concluding section for everyone to have their like Q&A for, what happened over the course of that synchronous session, and having the faculty member be that facilitator of that dialogue, making that, prompting students with those informations. So that would be the synchronous approach. The asynchronous approach is probably, you may think a little more challenging because how are you going to get that rich dialogue? But what can happen, and we did this in a biology course with a faculty member, and the students got together in small groups at a time that made sense with them, for them, and they collaborated on a Google Doc where they were able to add their thoughts, perspectives, resources, kind of in like a sequence in a Google Doc. You could also do this in a Canvas discussion board in small groups, depending on the size of your class. I know the graduate courses, maybe it's a whole group discussion, but maybe for the larger undergraduate or introductory courses, having small groups broken out so they can dialogue within their small group and find a time or space or a situation that they can work best to communicate and collaborate. And then bringing everyone together in some sort of, a whole course discussion or Google Doc or slides that comes together at the end of the class, and facilitated maybe a on-the-go lecture of, you gather every group's perspectives, opinions, put them into a short lecture video to kind of talk about kind of what you heard from them. So there's a couple different ways we can set that up in Canvas to have those debates and asynchronous interactions. And then there's also the hybrid approach, right? So that kind of goes back to that synchronous flipped classroom, but having the students, do part of it in Canvas. Maybe they have the dialogue, some initial documents, those prep things that I talked about, the what information do I have, what information do I need, and what questions I have. Maybe they do some of that assignment asynchronously, and then come back and have a richer dialogue in a synchronous session. So that's a couple ways you can do it. And if you have any questions about that, I'll talk about in a couple more slides of how we can help with that. Our instructional designers are amazing at the Center for Online and Continuing Education to help navigate maybe what that online experience can be. So reviewing the case, you could be a debate, so people can come up with their opening statements of what they think the case is about. And I know that has like a law type court case vibe to it, but it doesn't have to be. There's debates in research all the time about theories or concepts that really, span all industries. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like a criminal case or something like that. It can just be a perspective, two differing perspectives. And then having the Q&A, the evidence, the things like that. So mimicking that, but it could be in a variety of different ways. Then there's the trial, right? So there's someone who has a specific or a group of students who have a specific, they're pro or against the conversation, and having them have that debate of a plaintiff and that approach. And then there's also the open discussion. So having students just have an open dialogue about what the case is, and just allowing that to kind of flow on its own, and hopefully having the instructor guide where that conversation is with thoughtful questions that are pointed maybe towards that learning objective that they're hoping the students gain. And I think probably one of my favorites is submitting a report of like their findings and their process of the case. Like, how did I get to where I am? Having them kind of go back and document their process of, okay, wow, I thought about this, I then, considered this, and having them have a final report that they would submit at the end of the course, maybe after the dialogue or something like that, are different ways to approach reviewing the case. So creating instructions for the cases are time consuming, I'll say. They definitely require thought because cases can easily kind of veer off maybe into something that isn't for the course, or focused on the learning objective you really want students to attain. So asking for feedback, having that dialogue with a colleague or former students or current students, and saying, hey, does this make sense? Where would you go with this? How can this be improved? Or if you want to talk about it with an instructional designer, we're here as well, kind of putting ourselves in that student position of, am I understanding? Here's where I'm going through, and kind of working on your online course together. And then here's what I want to get to is that rubric piece, really setting expectations for the students of what you hope them to attain, maybe not what you hope that they think the answer is, because I think in case studies, it's okay if you have the evidence, the support, the research, you have the dialogue of your peers, and you come up with an answer that maybe isn't the one that was originally thought of when the scenario was developed. I still think is valid, and I think that's up for the instructor to decide. But in my instance, I would love it if a student was like, actually, I think this is my answer, and here's why. And they report and they are able to communicate what and how they got to their conclusion. I would accept that, because I think that if it's a valid argument, why not? And maybe it wasn't what I had in mind. And I think that's kind of where the rubric comes in, is what do you hope? You hope to them to come to a conclusion? Do you hope that they, are able to explain a specific concept in this case? So having more general that allows for that critical thinking to happen, but also kind of guiding the student in their learning of what your expectations are for them during this case method process. And of course, you have to build the assignments, the discussions, if you're having small groups, into Canvas, so that the student has that ability or understanding of what's expected of them, maybe even in those synchronous sessions. Like, what should I have prepared for this synchronous session? And having those expectations in the assignment in Canvas. Yeah.
Nicole, I was just going to say also that rubric would in all likelihood would or could, I suppose, include some information about how they handle themselves within the group, right?
Absolutely. I think having accountability, I think maybe is the point that we're trying to make for the students. to be held accountable to their colleagues and their fellow classmates of you know, engaging in that dialogue. It's an open, safe space for them to really think about their perspectives of what they learned and how they interpreted the information from the faculty member. And I think that is probably the coolest thing about online discussions is we have these, maybe recorded lectures, or maybe they're watching the live recorded lecture, and they get to talk to other students like, oh, that's what they meant when they said this, or maybe we should reach out to the faculty member and see, did they mean this or this? And having that conversation not only helps the faculty member improve their teaching practice, at least I would appreciate that, to seeing what the students hear me say about the information and how it's being applied, I think is helpful for sure. So yeah, absolutely. Having that, I think sometimes there can be a rubric of like, how would you gauge yourself? How would you judge yourself and how you collaborated with your team? And then maybe how would you rate your colleagues? And I think we have a couple templates for that if anyone needs them for some of the group work that we do in our Teaching Online Pedagogy and Practice workshop that Dr. Judy facilitates. So coming to the end of our presentation, we have a few more slides. Is I think the important role for the instructor is really to facilitate the dialogue, keeping it focused on what your intentions for the case are. And hopefully not giving away too much. I know that's hard if you have, the case planned out with, I know in a link that I'll provide, there's an opportunity to get, what they think the answer is or what they hope the outcome is. But allowing them to kind of maybe think of a new one, I think is helpful. But also that's the challenge of the facilitation. But providing thoughtful questions for students, really targeting them like, okay, but how would this work if you were in this country? If it's an international course, or they're talking about something like that, really focusing them on having them consider the specific aspects that you want them to talk about, and refocus them, maybe if they're getting a little bit off track, which can sometimes happen when, students are in a group together, and really being there as that support, like, have they considered this? Have they thought about that? Having those types of conversations with the students as they're talking about the case. And allow time for reflection. I think spacing out, giving them the information, having them go through this process of figuring out what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, giving them a couple weeks, I might say. If it's a short semester, obviously a couple days we'll have to do, but giving them that time to reflect. So they were giving that information, maybe not calling them out on the spot as soon as the case is revealed, or maybe getting those, what are your initial thoughts, and then having them reflect on them over time, or at the end of the case of, maybe you initially thought that you were going to be for this theory or use this theory. And then after you kind of learn more about the approach, how it's used, maybe they have a different perspective. And that would be interesting to find out, is through the case and the experience of that method, how maybe their initial reactions to a situation have changed. That would be cool. And we have to provide that time for students to reflect on that. So that's kind of the what, why, and how that we can use case method teaching in the online environment. That is not without saying that this is an easy approach. There are areas for improvement of how we're going to implement these. Advanced planning. I know it's going to take time, maybe more time than putting together some multiple choice questions or doing something like that. Really planning out how you want this case to go is going to take time, and I understand that. So just something to keep in mind if you're considering this approach. Managing equal student voice. I know that some students are leaders, right? And they are ready to go. They have their opinions. They know what they're going to say. And then we have some other students who maybe have really incredible things to contribute, but maybe aren't having that opportunity for that voice, and just kind of encouraging that equal student voice and dialogue and participation, which is the next bullet. Providing thought-provoking questions is also sometimes challenging, not giving the right answer, but also guiding them in the right way, and being in contact with your students in order to give that facilitation, because you don't want them at the end to come up with this great, totally kind of maybe off topic. So really being engaged with the different groups and the different students of in order to provide that feedback is also time consuming and a challenge, but I think to me it would be worth it. And one of the most important things that I think is transitioning student expectations from knowledge retention to application. And I think a lot of times now students are studying for their final exams, right? What are the questions on my multiple choice exam that I can get right? What chapters do I need to study? And, what sections am I going to be asked about? Kind of all that is integrated into an application approach for assessment is, okay, yes, but even when they leave your class or, leave the university, they're going to have to apply the information. If it's just apply critical thinking, right? So having that be the expectation of students from the beginning of, in this class, you're not going to memorize things for a multiple choice exam. We're going to use a case-based application method. And that might be a little challenging for students to kind of switch that modality of, okay, I'm not studying for a final. I actually have to learn the material to be able to apply it and complete my assignments. So that could be some challenging conversations there. And then structuring the unstructured. How do you structuring an open dialogue among students can be a little bit challenging, especially in a large class. So figuring out maybe time codes or an agenda or something like that might be helpful to kind of help structure this unstructured, fluid approach to teaching. And then also, you want students to communicate, right? You want to open that dialogue, but then you also, want to keep them focused on what you hope them to learn, they learn, right? So it's encouraging that dialogue, but also guiding it, which I know can be a challenge. But I think all of these areas for improvement are worth it for the student and what they're going to get out of your class. And so that's kind of why I'm passionate about this. Really quick, I do want to go to tips, and then I'm going to skip to the end and kind of open the floor for anyone to share kind of how they use it in their online class, which could be different than this, and that's totally okay. This is just one way that I thought of incorporating it online. But some tips that I thought were considering your audience. I know I was reading some case studies, and they talked about floppy disks. I was like, it's a little bit outdated for this population of students maybe to connect with. So you want to see who is my audience? Am I with the times, or maybe you used a case for years, and maybe just updating some of the language and technology of that case could be helpful. Ensuring diversity and inclusion in your scenarios, right? I think that's really important to make sure that everyone is represented in that scenario. Pulling from lived experiences, I think sometimes they're a little close to my heart when I'm talking about something that maybe I've done or a situation or scenario I've been in, but I think that makes it real for the students and having them understand that I've been there, I've done that, here's what I did, what would you have done, things like that. Building that connection with your students, I think that also helps. Having students develop part one, of the case. So seeing what they're thinking about. What do they think your content and your materials apply to the real world? How do they interpret that? And then asking yourself, who are my students? What are their experiences? Are they full-time workers? Maybe they already have a situation that they can share. If they've been in the industry for a while and they're maybe coming back for their degree in a graduate program or something. What do they already know? Right? What's their previous knowledge? Do I need to support them in anything that I'm going to include in the case? And what do they need to know when you're thinking about implementing cases? And then, as I mentioned again, being there as a facilitator. I do want to open the floor for the last few minutes to anyone who would like to share maybe how they did it in their online course. Yeah, Dr. McClellan, I see. Yeah, having students using, they're adult learners, right? We know that adult learners enjoy having that application, that real world experience, because that's what they're in, right? Maybe they're in the industry, and having them pull from their own experience and their own workforce may make them more interested in the class, right? Because they're using their own knowledge and experience, and then allowing others. I think it's a little vulnerable, but still, I think it allows them to kind of have that open dialogue of, here's the situation I'm in, and using that to help them kind of figure out what they're going to do. Absolutely. Oh, there you are, Dr. Crane.
Okay, all right. I could not unmute myself, so good. Okay, so I've been using case studies for maybe close to 2 years now, and this is in graduate level in business. And what I've ended up doing is to find cases that have already been developed, and then I apply them. Developing your own cases, at least at this level, is very time intensive, and there's lots of other materials out there to use. Some of them are open source, some of them are there's a cost to it on a cost per student kind of basis. That's how Harvard charges. And most of my courses are asynchronous in format, so that's sort of challenging in a sense. So what I've ended up doing is I take a business case that has all sorts of information, and then I decide what points I want to teach over several weeks. And then I have basically an assignment drawn from the case for each week over several weeks. And then the students are working in a group. I give them the introduction. I teach them the theory that they need to have to apply the case facts to the assignment that week. And then it's important, if you do it this format, it's important to have kind of a structure. So I would deploy the assignment, let's say on Saturday, and then the group has 3 days to talk amongst themselves and to present their deliverable 3 days later. And then the rest of the class has to respond to so many postings within 2 days after that. And that takes me through Friday, I think. So, and then I repeat the cycle again. I come up with a new assignment on Saturday, and then 3 days, and then 2 days after that. So that's how I use it. I don't want to spend the time to develop all the materials myself. I come up with the assignments for the points that I want to teach a specific week as the course progresses. And just to give you an example, I will use cases throughout most of the semester, and I'll use a total of 2 or 3 cases over the entire semester. And it takes that much, I can get that much material out of a single case.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think that that's an incredible approach. And I like how it's across the course and they get to see it evolve over time as they learn that new materials. So thank you so much for sharing. And it is just around that time to close out the session. But I want to thank everyone for being here today and hopefully gaining some insights of using case method in their approach. And thank you, Dr. Crane, for sharing kind of how he does it in business. And we hope, I do have some references and resources kind of across the spectrum and time range since this approach has been used for over a century. And the answer to the trivia is the General Shoe Company, which was the inaugural Harvard business case that kind of started this, that was published back in the day. So thank you all for joining us. And we hope that you come back. We have a PD session on, not next week because it's a holiday, but the following week on the 7th, we have a PD session really focused around teaching online and pedagogy. So that's something that we will talk about as we continue these sessions.
And we will be sharing all of the information that Nicole has shared. We will definitely send it out to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We do appreciate all that you bring to this.